Hello everybody, Michael here for Tactica Imperialis. Welcome to today's video. Today will be another Warhammer 40,000 theory video, originally spawned in my own head, but also from a question asked by the Bear 1337. We've been discussing Primarchs on the channel in theory videos as of late, and them switching sides. And Choppy wonders what would happen if we take that to the extreme. Specifically, they want to know which Loyalist Primarch would fill the roles of Magnus the Red, Mortarion, Angron, and Fulgrim in following a particular Chaos God if every single Primarch were to switch sides. So, take all 9 Traitors and make them the Loyalists, take the 9 Loyalists and make them Traitors, what happens? Now, as ever, I'm going to go one step further than Choppy's simple question. I want to know which Loyalists will follow a certain god, but I also want to know who will be Warmaster, and of course, if the new Traitors could actually succeed where the original ones failed. So, today, we're flipping 30k on its head to see just what might have been. Let us begin. We'll start ourselves off with Choppy's question. Which Loyalist will follow which Chaos God? Arbitrarily, we'll go by ascending sacred number and start with Slaanesh. So Slaanesh wants someone who seeks pleasure, perfection, etc, 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 and we have 9 Primarchs still currently in play. And while I'd love to drag this out, rule every single Primarch out one by one until there was a single one left standing, this one's pretty easy to fill in my opinion. We're giving Slaanesh Guilliman of the Ultramarines. So why the 13th? Well, for a start, I don't think many of the other 8 come even close to Slaanesh's style. There's no flair or extravagance to them, and in many cases they're kind of a bit bland personality-wise. As far as joy, which is one of Slaanesh's overriding emotions, goes, you could consider Russ for his great feasts and hunts on Fenris, but his brutal approach and no-nonsense battlefield strategy is not very Slaaneshi in my opinion. Sanguinius is an alternative. He's very pure, very perfect, very elegant, etc. But he's very sympathetic to the plights of the people, doesn't want people to suffer. He never really seeks personal glory or pleasure either. Which brings me back to Guilliman and the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines are perfectionists in their own way, particularly with the 40k Codex Astartes, but we have to look at them pre-heresy because otherwise it makes no sense. Even before Guilliman was found on Macragge, the 13th were a prideful legion, often openly competing with the other legions, particularly those who actually had their Primarchs, to see who had achieved more, and they clung tightly to their honour. They also had a bit of a penchant for victory markings, though this was more by squad than across the legion, as was the case with the Emperor's Children, who, of course in the canon timeline, do serve Slaanesh. The battlefield approach was simple, if uninspiring. Using predefined stratagems, lightning-fast tactical strikes would destroy the enemy, whilst minimising casualties amongst Astartes or civilians. They were almost too precious to lose in a very roundabout way. It's also worth noting that their gene seed was extremely stable, despite there being no Primarch around, which was a bit rare, further demonstrating their own purity and adding to that perfectionist vibe that we need. When Guilliman does come on the scene, a lot remains the same in terms of the approach to war, but he introduced a deep-rooted respect for hierarchy and an approach to government and organisation as efficient as these battlefield stratagems they've been using in the Crusade. It must be noted this was not hero worship towards Guilliman, simply the most efficient way of running things. This would further drive the Ultramarines towards the perfectionists who seek personal honours to advance themselves within the Legion. And another push, ironically, would be their strict adherence to the tenets of the Imperial truth. It sounds very weird, but run with me on this. The problem with the 13th, compared to the Emperor's Children anyway, was their lack of extravagance. Everything was very calculated, very efficient, far from these transcendent joys and agonies that Slaanesh so loves. This is likely why in the canon timeline the 3rd Legion are the ones who fall to the Dark Prince, though the Layer Blade that Fulgrim had and the Demonic Whispering and Chaplain Erebus will have had a hand in it too, whilst the Ultramarines of course stood loyal. But in our parallel universe of reversed fates, it's Guilliman and the Ultramarines who fall to Slaanesh. Shout out Sanguinius for at least making me think about it though. Next up, Nergal. The Lord of Decay seemingly favours the resilient warriors, at least if Mortarion was anything to go on, but his hatred/mirrorness of Tzeentch would also suggest an anti-Psyker Primarch would also take Nergal's box. So that gives us Manus and Vulcan for the tough ones, and then Russ, Corax, and Dawn for the anti-Psykers. Dawn could debatably be called resilient, but nowhere near the level of the other two, so we're not going to put him in that category. So who are we going to pick? Well, I'm going to knock out Russ here. He's far too aggressive and impatient for Nergal, though his joviality does kind of help his case, although it's kind of tenuous. Vulcan was tough. We don't really know about his psychic tendencies, but I think he was slightly pro-psyker. Though as a flamey type of guy and a blacksmith, his approach isn't exactly Nergal's, because fire stops things growing back or surviving, it just incinerates, and that's not Nergal's style. Corax is far too flimsy and sullen to ever end up serving Nergal, plus he's super fast and sneaky, which is more like Tzeentch or Slaanesh. So, Dorn or Manus? It's got to be Manus for me. I mean, the guy's Legion were probably just as tough as the Death Guard, even it's a different form of resilience. Their high amount of metallics would present an awesome corrosion aesthetic, personally, and Manus had arms of living metal. I could see it happening that Nergal, quote-unquote, helps Manus with his arms by infecting the things, and then sending the Iron Hands to raid a Tomb World so more warriors can do the same. Admittedly, I look at Manus and I see the aesthetics behind him going to Nergal, but his and Insul's resilience, his slow methodical approach, his preference for infantry combat are all swing factors. Sadly, his stance on Psychers is unknown, as at least at the Council of Nicaea, the Iron Hands were either poorly or not represented at all. As for why I'm not picking Dorn, I think he's a little bit too simply flimsy for Nergal. He's tougher than Corax, yes, but he's nowhere near the league of Manus and Vulcan. Plus his blunt honesty and seeming humorlessness, though not emotionlessness, really don't suit Nergal. While Manus was a bit flat, his relationship with Fulgrim pre-heresy was a very happy one, so he is capable of that sort of thing. If Manus wasn't here, I think Dorn would be in with a shout, but I'm giving the Gorgon to Grandfather Nergal. Now then, let's talk about Khorne. There are two really obvious choices to put into Khorne's slot, Leman Russ and Sanguinius. The honourable mentions would be Jagtai Khan, Vulcan, as well as the Psycho-hating Corax if he wasn't such a sneaky bugger. Vulcan would embody a different aspect of Khorne to the others. He's a smith, a master artisan of weaponry, which Khorne kind of is. There's a lot of mastercrafted and ornate weaponry and brass armour, etc, etc, etc. Khan was a very skilled warrior with a penchant for speed and slaughter to a degree, with no real desire to rule, which for Khorne would be pretty fitting. Kill stuff, move on, nothing else. But it is really, really hard not to give it to the Wolf King or to the Angel. Sanguinius probably has the strongest link with Khorne, in the form of the Red Thirst and then later the Black Rage. His imagery as a winged angel also mirrors that of the Bloodthirsters, winged demons. He was actually called Brother, or something to that effect, by Kabanda, a Bloodthirster. He was very honourable as a warrior, which Khorne is, and the whole blood theme is very Khornate, perhaps obviously. But Sanguinius is a psyker of sorts. I don't know if he's actually been shown using psychic powers, but he certainly had a high psychic potential. In fact, the entire Blood Angels Legion has a higher psychic potential. They're all very psychically linked to one another, and Khorne would really frown upon that. On top of that, Sanguinius tried to cure the Red Thirst. He didn't try to embrace it, he didn't really go down that route, and that could have proved an obstacle, at least if we follow the canonic timeline the entire way. I mean, I don't know when the Red Thirst exactly broke out, but it's possible that in the alternate timeline, Sanguinius would go down that route, embrace the Red Thirst, and go to Khorne. Russ, on the other hand, is more akin to a cool-headed Angron, if that makes any sense. A brutally powerful, close combat fighter with a special power boost, in this case the Canis Helix and his gene seed, as opposed to the Butcher's Nails. Russ was also an honourable fighter, had a real hatred of psychers like Khorne does, and he had a genetic flaw that could make his warriors murderous monsters. In this case, the Wolfen as opposed to the Death Company or the Red Thirst. As a bonus point, Russ embodies less of the aspects of the other gods. Sanguinius has decent similarities with Slaanesh, as we mentioned earlier, and with Tzeentch for his psychic power, whereas Russ is tied to Nergal and Slaanesh by means of his humour, and to Nergal by his hatred of psychers, which is honestly more Khorne's thing. And it's a tenuous link, realistically. To be honest, you could probably give either of these two to Khorne, and you'd be able to justify it pretty cleanly. But I'm going to give it to Russ, just because Sanguinius' ties to the other gods gives him a Chaos Undivided vibe, while Russ fits Khorne more neatly and has no real complications like psychic powers, etc, etc. I can envision the Thunderwolf Juggernaut and Wolfhound hybrids already. Finally, we have Tzeentch. Perhaps unsurprisingly for the Changer of Ways, I had a really hard time working this one out. The first logical step would be to mirror Magnus and pick a Psyker, which gives us Sanguinius and Corax, sort of, and I think that's actually about it. Now, either of these two could fit here in a way. Sanguinius, as I stated in a previous theory, may end up doing a Magnus and accidentally falling to Chaos, or to Tzeentch to cure the Red Thirst, being manipulated, whilst Corax's preference for stealth is fitting for the subtle manipulator that is Tzeentch, though he hated Psykers, so we'll be knocking him out here. But we have to look beyond the Psykers too, in my opinion. Guilliman and Johnson are both also decent fits for Tzeentch, as well as Jagtai Khan, ironically, but we've given Guilliman to Slaanesh, so let's do the other two. Lion was shady, withdrawn, reserved, etc, etc, etc. He was also exposed to chaos from a very young age. Caliban was stalked by various chaos creatures, there were books of chaos lore, such as the ones found by Luther, and his first mission did involve hidden servants of some chaos entity or another. It's not stated it's Tzeentch, but it could have been. So it could be argued that Tzeentch had been setting Johnson up for a long time, and if he had discovered those chaos tomes on Caliban, his fate could have been very, very different. And if you add in the highly secretive and sometimes borderline treacherous behaviour of the Dark Angels in more recent history, you could certainly see them in the Changer of Ways' thrall if things had panned out differently. Now, I know I said in my last video Johnson was a pretty safe Loyalist Primarch, and obviously there are a few different factors that we have to consider, but I say in an alternate universe where he finds those chaos tomes, he could have easily been drawn in by Tzeentch. As for Khan, he was very pro-Psyker. His chief librarian was sent to the Council of Nicaea for crying out loud. The only Primarch for the Psykers was Magnus. I don't know why Khan wasn't there, but he sent his chief librarian, which is pretty good. The Scars themselves are also rather shamanistic. The Storm Seers, their rituals that they have, such as the Master of the Hunt, it's all quite, not ritualistic, but you get what I mean. However, Khan was not one of the more subtle Primarchs, with a very blunt style, not a real controller, manipulator. So I think Tzeentch could have passed them over for selection. Though the White Scars having a preference for Tzeentch could actually be argued, so maybe that chief librarian will pull the Scars in, kind of Callus Typhon style. However, if we're actually going to give a Primarch to Tzeentch, I'm just about going to give it to Lion, though the temptation to put Sanguinius in is strong. The reason why the first Primarch edges it for me is the nature of the Legion. Johnson himself, as far as we know, was not a Psyker, but the Dark Angels have that subtle hidden style, were more exposed to chaos through Caliban, plus Luther could have had an Erebus-like sway over Johnson, so Luther does to Johnson what Erebus did to Lorgar. The Blood Angels are a precision tool, to be sure, and Sanguinius is the nearest reflection of Magnus amongst these new traitors, but I think their direct, close-quarters style is just a little too anti-Tzeentch and pro-everybody else, further reinforcing that Chaos Undivided feeling. Honestly, you could call this one in a number of ways, so you're welcome to disagree, suggest your own choice, but for me, for Tzeentch, it's Lionel Johnson. Okay, let's recap a bit, shall we? So, we have Guilliman for Slaanesh, Ferrus Manus for Nergal, Leman Russ for Khorne, and Lionel Johnson for Tzeentch. But who's going to be the new Warmaster? Well, left in play we have Vulcan, Sanguinius, Corax, Khan, and Dawn. Khan is not the ruler type, as we mentioned before, so he's out. Corax grew up a prisoner and a slave, so becoming dominant over a force that behaved in such a way, with enslavement, etc., would be pretty anathema to his nature. So he's pretty much out, because I don't think he had quite the leadership style that the Warmaster would need. Vulcan, as well as being an extremely nice guy, was very much in favour of equality, self-sacrifice, something so far removed from a dominating Warmaster of Chaos as to pretty much rule him out entirely. I mean, he was likeable, but not enough for him to ever hold sway over people. Dawn wasn't exactly emotionless. I mean, his rage was terrifying if he was roused, and he was quite a deep thinker at times, but he lacked the charisma to ever hold sway over the other Primarchs and Legions. Plus, again, he didn't see himself as a ruler, simply a conqueror and warrior, This is possibly why Horus got the job in the canonic timeline when Dawn's battle record was almost as impressive. And, surprise, surprise, that leaves Sanguinius. This is why I kept Sanguinius back, basically, even though he could have easily taken Khorne's or Tzeentch's slot. Johnston and Russ also lacked that charisma or leadership quality required to be a Warmaster. Remember, Johnston actually refused to lead Imperium Secundus, though if Sanguinius hadn't shown up, he'd have been forced to do so. Guilliman's out for the same reason, and Manus, I don't think Manus was quite likeable enough either. Sanguinius is basically the only one of the new traitors capable of being Warmaster. I mean, according to Horus, he should have been anyway. Plus, as we've seen throughout the video, he embodies at least 3 of the gods in some form or another. Certainly more, he has more links to them than anybody else, particularly Khorne and Tzeentch and also Slaanesh. Finding a bond with Nergal would be more difficult, although you could argue that his desire to preserve life would do that. This gives him the capability of bearing the mark of Chaos Ascendant if it existed back then, and you have the perfect counter to Abaddon in Azkaelon. He was the most loved and respected of all Primarchs. He is naturally the choice to be Warmaster for the new traitors. Plus, couldn't you imagine just how incredible a corrupted Sanguinius could look? Think Asterath the Grim with a demonic twist, and yeah. But that raises the most important question of them all. Who wins the quote-unquote Sanguinian heresy? For ease, realistically, we're going to allow all 18 legions and Primarchs to duke it out on Terra, as events in the run-up, such as the Istvan events, the events on Prospero, the inverses of those are way too hard to track and predict. So we're just going to let all 18 of them go at it, and we'll see what happens. So now we arrive at Holy Terra. The traitors, led by the corrupted angel Sanguinius, launched their assault on the imperial palace that has been fortified by Perturabo and whose defense is led by Horus Lupercal. Who wins? Well, the traitors compared to the old ones haven't lost a lot in terms of their hitting power. The World Eaters are switched for the Wolfen and Blood Angels who have succumbed to the Red Thirst. The Night Lords swap places with the Raven Guard in terms of stealth troops, the Death Guard switch for the Iron Hands as the resilient ones, and the myriad sorcerers from the Thousand Sons of the other legions are now primarily drawn from the Dark Angels, the Blood Angels, and debatably the Ultramarines. They've also gained a second Outrider force in the White Scars, although they have lost the Zealous Wordbearers, and if they wished, they could establish an indomitable fortress of their own thanks to Dawn's Imperial Fists and Vulcan's Salamanders, all whilst being coordinated on the ground by Guilliman and the Ultramarines, and in space by Sanguinius. We're going to assume that Sanguinius behaves like Horus for the most part. But the Loyalists have changed too. The palace defences will have evolved under the Iron Warriors, likely making use of the Death Guard's toxins, the psychic power of the Thousand Suns, and their own mastery of machines to create trap rooms and kill zones for the traitors. In Magnus the Red and the Thousand Sons, they have the most powerful Psyker outside the Emperor and the strongest legion in terms of psychic potential, assuming the Blood Angels haven't had a massive power boost because they didn't go directly to Tzeentch. With Horus coordinating the brutal counter-assaults of Angron's World Eaters and the Zealous Wordbearers, Conrad Kurz and Alfarius leading their legions in guerrilla attacks and disrupting traitor scouts, and the effortless combat prowess of both the Sons of Horus and Emperor's Children, they still present an incredibly tough bulwark, not to mention the Custodes and, of course, the Emperor himself. But would it be enough? Well, it's really tough to say, and I'm going to encourage you now to come up with your own answer and stick it in the comments. But for me, I think the Battle for Terra would have panned out very differently. The traitors would have landed, created their own bastion during the initial siege, leaving, let's say, the Imperial Fist back and possibly even some salamanders to help fortify Terra, rather than doing what the Emperor's Children did on Terra and attacking the Administratum. This gives them a staging post from which to attack the Administratum, etc., as well as keep the pressure on the palace. I believe the Battle for Terra would have become much more of a typical back and forth grinder war than simply a one-way siege. There'd also be various espionage and scouting operations run by Kurz, Alfarius, Khan, and Korax. The initial assault on the palace would have been repulsed. I think, thanks to some clever defenses and powerful counterattacks, particularly if the counter-assault and counter-espionage forces were able to get the sabotage attacks dealt with very easily. The Traitors would have also lost some demonic power too. I couldn't find an equivalent for Lorgar to give them one. You could argue Johnson would do it because Magnus wasn't around for the Traitors on Canon Terror, so maybe. But I do think we have some problems with that. So anyway, the Traitors lose the initial assault, but they're not pushed back off of Terra. I just think they fall back to their base, built by Dawn. Horus once said that his legion besieging the Imperial Fist would be a never-ending stalemate, and that makes it pretty hard to see the Loyalists breaking that traitor bastion, especially if Sanguinius' favour with Chaos saw his and his legion's power rise to or above the level of Magnus and his kin in terms of psychic power. As a result, if you combine a few factors, I think the Traitors would slowly, inexorably, gain the upper hand and push the Loyalists back to the palace. If the blockade in space cuts off Loyalist reinforcement and allows the Traitors to resupply, and they get some access to demons, Sanguinius would eventually find himself in Canon Horus's position, looking over the palace with victory in his grasp. And this is the important bit. Canon Horus was going to win if he left his shields up. And I think that if Theory Sanguinius does the same, I think the Traitors will eventually win. There are a couple of other factors. So, the swing factor number one is Sanguinius choosing to engage in the battle. If he does that personally, anywhere, the Emperor can get at him because they can find him and teleport to him, just as Horus did with the Vengeful Spirit. Swing factor two, the Traitors have to keep the rest of the Imperium at bay in space or with other uprisings long enough to win on Terra. If the Imperium can resupply or rearm, it will win through weight of numbers because the Imperial army is a thing. If those two conditions are met, i.e. Sanguinius stays hidden and out of the fighting, and the Traitor blockade holds, I think the Loyalist Astartes would indeed lose, though almost all of the Traitor Primarchs and or Sanguinius himself would die in the final battle just to get rid of the Emperor. The corrupted angel could only enter the fray once the Loyalists and their Primarchs were dead, and the Emperor stood basically alone, so as to ensure that his possible defeat at the hands of his father would not stop Chaos's ultimate victory. Of course, there are many variables that have to go into this, but I do think that in a straight 9v9 slog, the Sanguinian heresy would be won by the Traitors, if they could hold in space and keep their Warmaster safe and alive until the very end. So there we go. My thoughts on what would happen if the roles were reversed when the Primarchs turned traitor. Guilliman for Slanesh, Manus for Nergal, Russ for Khorne, Johnson for Tzeentch, Sanguinius the Warmaster, and, if a certain amount of circumstances are met and conditions are followed through, then a traitor victory. How terrifying. Of course, this is all my opinion, and I'm sure many of you have your own opinions on the matter, in terms of who takes what role, and of course who actually wins. If you do, or you just want to call me a heretic, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, as well as suggesting some other theories you'd like me to take on in future. The next theory, we'll be talking about demonhood. Someone left a comment a while ago that really got my creative juices going, and I really want to take it on. For now though, it's time to end. Thank you very much for watching the video. I do hope you enjoyed it. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Bye for now.